So, a few weeks ago, I uploaded a video showing you how I installed a third-party regulator in my pre-charged pneumatic air arms rifle. At the end of that video, I said that I would show you how to test the regulator once it's installed and how to make minor adjustments to the valve and hammer system. Well, we're going to do that today. I'm going to run through some very important information, and at the end, we'll take a look at the data and answer a very important question. Was it worth the money, the risk, and the effort to actually fit the regulator? Let's get to it, shall we? The very first thing you need to know is that because the pressure gauge on the air arms S510 is located behind the regulator, once the regulator is installed, it will show the regulated pressure and not the cylinder pressure. This is one of the big disadvantages of fitting regulator in the S510 and something you'll definitely want to consider before making a final decision. When testing the regulator, it's very important to know the exact cylinder pressure at all times so that you can plot a pressure to velocity graph. There is a way to do this, and we'll get to that a little later in this video. But first, in order to know what difference the regulator has made to the consistency and efficiency of the rifle, you'll need to know how the rifle performs unregulated. So before I installed the lane regulator into my S510, I filled the gun to the maximum working pressure of 200 bar and shot a full string over the chronograph until I saw the velocity dropping significantly. This was the result. Now, most people would expect the graph of pressure to velocity to look like this. After all, a higher pressure would cause the pellet to be propelled through the barrel faster, correct? No. Interestingly enough, almost all unregulated air rifles will give you a graph that looks something more like this. This is called a power curve, and the dip in velocity at higher pressures is due to the fact that the valve is closing faster. The hammer hits the valve with the same force every time you pull the trigger. At high pressures, there's a greater force opposing the movement of the valve, and therefore less air is released. At lower pressures, the valve is open for longer, but there is significantly less force behind the pellet. The reason velocity peaks at a certain point is because the balance between the valve and hammer system is just right. In order to be accurate over long distances, you want to keep your velocity as consistent as possible. Serious shooters will try to keep the extreme spread less than 30 feet per second, 20 if you plan to shoot long range. What a regulator does is it keeps the air pressure behind the valve consistent so that the valve releases exactly the same amount of air for exactly the same duration every time you pull the trigger. The lane regulator I installed in my S510 was set at 135 bar. In theory, the graph from a regulated airgun should look like this. The line should be almost completely flat until the point at which the cylinder pressure drops below the regulated pressure. When that happens, the regulator remains open and the velocity should begin to drop with every shot. Another advantage of fitting a regulator is that you are often able to fill the rifle to a higher pressure than you would without the regulator. How can this be, you may ask? After all, it's printed on the air arm cylinder, maximum pressure 200 bar. Well, that is printed there with the valve system taken into account. Filling the rifle beyond 200 bar is risky because the valve and hammer aren't designed to deal with pressures higher than 200 bar. But once the regulator is installed, the valve operates at 135 bar, no matter what pressure you fill to, and so it becomes a question of how strong the cylinder is rather than how strong the valve is. The air arm cylinder is actually capable of holding pressures up to 300 bar and higher. However, to be safe, I'm only going to fill to 250 bar for this test. Let's get started. Right, sorry about the terrible lighting conditions this morning, but I wanted the light to be right for the chronograph. It's a really old chronie, and it only picks up the velocity of the pellets in certain light conditions. So we've got a small window now where we might be able to chronie this gun. What I did was, last night, I filled the gun to 50 bar, and I checked this morning just to make sure that there were no leaks, and it's exactly where I left it, which is already good news. It means that the polishing of the cylinder worked. There's no leaks from the cylinder out that vent hole. A lot of you may be asking, now that the regulator is fitted, the gauge at the bottom doesn't work above the regulated pressure, so how am I going to read the pressure inside the cylinder? And there's actually a really easy way to do this, and again, I learned this from Robert's channel, Airgun Regulators. The channel's called Airgun Regulators on YouTube, and I learned this from there, and it's a very valuable tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this camera. Okay, now I'm going to attach the gun to the cylinder. I'm going to fill the gun to 100 bar. From here it's quite simple. You begin to shoot over the chronograph, and after every shot you take, you record the pressure and the velocity. Once the cylinder pressure begins to drop below regulated pressure, you should see the velocities begin to drop quite drastically. At this point you can stop shooting. So this is the original graph from the S510, and here are the results from our first test with the regulator installed. You can see that above the regulated pressure, all the shots are very consistent and there is no steep curve. This shows us that the regulator is doing exactly what it's designed to do. And you only really get a good idea of just how much of a difference the regulator has made when you edit the graph to only show the shots that fall within your desired extreme spread. As you can see, the regulator gives you way more usable shots per fill because the string is spread over a wider range of pressures. So I was pretty happy with the results. Already the improvement was, in my mind at least, totally worth the price of the regulator and the effort of installing it. But I wanted to experiment a little bit, so I decided to do a number of tests. In the first test, I adjusted the power down using the built-in transfer port knob on the S510. In theory, this should restrict the airflow through the transfer port and give me a slight increase in shot count. This shifted the line a little lower as expected, but didn't really save me much air, so I decided to leave the transfer port fully open. The second change I made was to replace the original valve return spring in the S510 with a spring supplied with the lane regulator. In theory, this stronger spring should cause the valve to close a little quicker, lowering my velocity but saving me air at the same time. Interestingly enough, while the extreme spread improved, there was almost no improvement to my shot count. So I just reinstalled the original S510 spring. The very last thing I tried was to fit a little collar over a section of the regulator. This hole over here basically allows air into the regulator from the cylinder. When you take a shot and the air is released from the regulated air chamber, the regulator gets to work almost instantly, letting more in from the cylinder to replace the used air. Now, when I looked at the graph, I saw a steady increase in velocity as the cylinder pressure decreased. This led me to think that perhaps at higher pressures, the regulator was letting new air into the chamber so quickly that this new air was actually causing the valve to close a little quicker. My theory was that making this hole a little smaller would slow the refill process down a little, allowing the valve to close with a little more consistency. What I did was I fitted the small collar over the hole to restrict the airflow a little. So the orange line shows the results with the collar fitted. Again, I was quite surprised to see that although the extreme spread was a little better than the original string, it actually made my shot count a little worse. So after all of this testing, I decided to settle on the original string, the one with no tweaking done to the rifle whatsoever. The extreme spread may be a little bigger, but I get about 50 shots from a 250 bar fill and 30 shots from a 220 bar fill. Considering the muzzle energy that it's putting out, I'm very happy with that. And that's it, guys. I know it's a heck of a lot of information to absorb, but hopefully that answered some questions. I personally think that it was totally worth it to install the regulator. I definitely wouldn't go back on my decision. Yes, the pressure gauge is stuck at 135 bar, which sucks quite a bit, but I've overcome this hurdle by purchasing extra magazines. Now I know that if I fill to 230 bar, I can use these 4 magazines and then I need to refill. And I know that all 40 of these shots will be very consistent, which means that I'm comfortable taking shots like this one from over 150 yards. I'll leave you to decide whether you think a regulator is worth purchasing for your guns. All guns are different and all shooters have different needs, so this one is totally up to you. If you do decide that you might want to install one, you'll definitely want to check out airgunregulators.com. This is Robert Lane's website, and I think you'll be extremely surprised to see how many different rifles he's actually designed regulators for. Robert Lane has been making regulators for PCP airguns for 18 years and has sold them in 99 different countries. And it's that experience that caused me to lean towards the Lane regulators instead of other brands. If you have time, take a look at his YouTube channel as well. Just search for Airgun Regulators. On this channel you'll find tons of really helpful videos telling you almost everything you need to know about what regulators are and how they work. Thanks for putting up with me throughout this long video, and I'll see you next time.